The founding of New England. The mingled economic and religious motives that lured English people to the Chesapeake also drew men and women to New England, the region the English called North Virginia, until Captain John Smith renamed it in 1616. But because Puritans organized the New England colonies and because of environmental factors, the northern settlements developed very differently from their southern counterparts. The divergence became apparent when, even as the would-be colonists left England. Contrasting regional religious patterns. Hoping to exert control over a migration that appeared disorderly, and which included dissenters seeking to flee the authority of the Church of England, royal bureaucrats in late 1634 ordered port officials in London to collect information on all travelers departing for the colonies. The resulting records for the year 1635 are a treasure trove for historians. They document the departure of 53 vessels, 20 to Virginia, 17 to New England, 8 to Barbados, 5 to St. Christopher, 2 to Bermuda, and 1 to Providence Island. Almost 5,000 people sailed on those ships, 2,000 bound for Virginia, about 1,200 for New England, and the rest for island destinations. Nearly 3/5 of the passengers were between 15 and 24 years old, reflecting the predominance of young male servants among migrants to most colonies in British America. But among those bound for New England, such youths constituted less than 1/3 of the total. Nearly 40% were older, and another third were younger. Whereas women made up just 14% of those headed to Virginia, they composed almost 40% of the passengers to New England. New England migrants often traveled in family groups. They also brought more goods and livestock with them and tended to travel with others from the same towns. More than half the passengers aboard one vessel came from York. On another, nearly half came from Buckinghamshire. In short, people migrated to New England with their close associates. This must have made their lives in North America more comfortable and less lonely than those of their southern counterparts. Contrasting regional demographic patterns. Puritan congregations quickly became key institutions in colonial New England. Anglican worship had less impact on the early development of the Chesapeake colonies, where spread-out settlement patterns made it difficult to organize a church. Catholic and Anglican bishops in England paid little attention to their co-religionists in America, and Chesapeake congregations languished in the absence of sufficient numbers of ordained clergymen. In 1665, only 10 of Virginia's 50 Church of England parishes had resident clerics. Not until the 1690s did the Church of England plant deeper roots in Virginia. By then, it had also replaced Catholicism as the established church in Maryland. In both New England and the Chesapeake, religion affected the lives of pious Calvinists who were expected to reassess the state of their souls regularly. Many devoted themselves to self-examination and Bible study, and families often prayed together under the guidance of the husband and father. Yet because even the most pious could never be certain they were among the elect, anxiety about their spiritual state troubled devout Calvinists. This anxiety lent a special intensity to their religious beliefs and to their concern with proper behavior, their own and that of others. Separatists who thought the Church of England too corrupt to be salvaged became the first religious dissenters to move to New England. In 1609, a separatist congregation relocated to Leiden in the Netherlands, where they found the freedom of worship denied them in Stuart England. But they soon found the Netherlands too permissive. The nation had tolerated them, also tolerated religions and behaviors they abhorred or disliked. Hoping to isolate themselves from worldly temptations, these people, known today as pilgrims, received permission from the Virginia Company to colonize the northern part of its territory. In September 1620, more than 100 people, only 30 of them separatists, set sail for England on the old and crowded Mayflower. Like a few English families that had settled along the coast of Newfoundland during the previous decade, the Pilgrims expected to support their colony through profits from cod fishery. In November, they landed on Cape Cod, farther north than they had intended. Given the lateness of the season, they decided to stay put. They moved across Massachusetts Bay to a fine harbor, named Plymouth by John Smith, who had visited it in 1614, and into the empty dwellings of a Pawtuxet village whose inhabitants had died in the epidemic of 1616 to 1618. Pilgrims and Pokanokets. Even before they landed, the Pilgrims had to surmount their first challenge from the strangers or non-separatists who sailed with them to America. Because they landed outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company, some of the strangers questioned the authority of the colony's leader. In response, the Mayflower Compact, signed in November 1620 on shipboard, established a civil body politic as a temporary substitute for a charter. The male settlers elected a governor and initially made all decisions for the colony at town meetings. Later, after more towns had been founded and the population increased, Plymouth Colony, like Virginia and Maryland, created an assembly to which the land-owning male settlers elected representatives. Like the Jamestown settlers before them, the residents of Plymouth were poorly prepared to subsist in the new environment. Only half of the Mayflower's passengers lived to see the spring. That the others survived owed much to the Pokanokets, a branch of the Wampanoags, who controlled the area. As many as 200,000 Algonquin-speaking people had lived in the region before contact. But Pokanoket villages had suffered terrible losses in the recent epidemic. To protect themselves from the powerful Narragansetts of the southern New England coast, the Pokanokets allied themselves with the newcomers. In the spring of 1621, their leader, or Sachem, Massasoit, agreed to a treaty, and during the colony's first year, the Pokanokets supplied the settlers with essential foodstuffs. The colonists had relied on Tisquantum, or Squanto, a Pawtuxet who served as a conduit between native peoples and Europeans, as Cortez's Doña Marina had done in Mexico. Captured by fishermen in the early 1610s and taken to Europe, Tisquantum had learned to speak English. On his return, he discovered that the epidemic had wiped out his village. Caught between worlds, Tisquantum became the settlers' interpreter and a major source of information about the environment. Massachusetts Bay Company. Before the 1620s ended, another group of Puritan dissenters, who hoped to reform the Church of England from within rather than to abandon it, launched the colonial enterprise that would come to dominate New England. They would later come to be known as Congregationalists for their insistence on a local level of church governance. Charles I, who became king in 1625, was more hostile towards Puritans than his father had been. Under his leadership, the Church of England drove dissenting clergymen from their pulpits, forcing congregations to worship secretly. Some Congregationalist merchants, concerned about their long-term prospects in England, dispatched a group of colonists to Cape Ann in 1628. The following year, the merchants obtained a royal charter, constituting themselves as the Massachusetts Bay Company. The new joint stock company quickly attracted the attention of Puritans, who were increasingly convinced that they no longer would be able to practice their religion freely in their homeland. They remained committed to the goal of reforming the Church of England, but concluded that they should pursue that aim in America. In a dramatic move, the Congregationalist merchants decided to transfer the Massachusetts Bay Company headquarters to New England. The settlers would then be answerable to no one in the mother country and would be able to handle their affairs, both secular and religious, as they pleased. Like the Plymouth settlers, they expected to profit from the cod fishery. They also planned to export timber products. Governor John Winthrop. In October 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company elected John Winthrop, a member of the lesser English gentry, as its governor. Winthrop organized the initial segment of the Puritan migration to America. In 1630, more than 1,000 English men and women moved to Massachusetts, most of them to Boston. By 1643, nearly 20,000 more had followed. Winthrop and his company were eager to avoid the failures that beset previous English settlements. Caught up in the currents of European utopian thought that overswept England in the 16th and 17th centuries, the colony's backers envisioned a utopia across the ocean, a new Jerusalem. Some time before the colonists embarked, Winthrop set down his expectations for the new colony in an essay called Christian Charity. Christian charity stressed the communal nature of the colonist endeavor. God, Winthrop explained, hath so disposed of the condition of mankind as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. But differences in status did not imply differences in worth. On the contrary, God had planned the world so that every man might have need of others, and from hence they might all be knit more neatly together in the bond of brotherly affection. In New England, Winthrop warned, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. If the Puritans failed to carry out their special commission from God, the Lord will surely break out in wrath against us, and the colony would become a story and a byword throughout the world." Almost unknown in its day, Winthrop's essay became famous 2 centuries later. In 1838, one of his descendants published it for the first time under its now familiar title, quote, "A Model of Christian Charity," recasting the discourse as a sermon preached en route to New England and as a parable about uniquely American virtues. Many modern-day politicians, most famously Ronald Reagan, have quoted Winthrop's speech to underline what they see as the exceptional destiny of the United States. But Winthrop, of course, could not have imagined an American nation. Rather, he envisioned a biblical commonwealth in which each person worked for the good of the whole. As in 17th century England, this ideal society would be characterized by clear hierarchies of status and power. But Winthrop hoped its members would live according to the precepts of Christian love. Of course, such an ideal was beyond human reach. Early Massachusetts and its Caribbean counterpart, Providence Island, had their share of bitter quarrels and unchristian-like behavior. Remarkably, though, in New England, the ideal persisted for generations. Covenant ideal. The Puritans expressed their communal ideal chiefly in the doctrine of the covenant. They believed God had made a covenant, that is, an agreement or a contract, with them when they were chosen for the special mission to America. In turn, they coveted with another, promising to work together towards their goals. The founders of the churches, towns, and even colonies in Anglo-America had drafted formal documents setting forth the principles on which their institutions would be based. The Pilgrims' Mayflower Compact was a covenant, as was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which laid down the basic law for the settlements established along the Connecticut River Valley. The leaders of Massachusetts Bay likewise transformed their original joint stock company charter into the basis for a covenanted community. Under pressure from land-owning male settlers, they gradually changed the General Court, officially the company's small governing body, into a colonial legislature. They also granted the status of freemen, or voting members, to all property-owning adult male church members. Less than 2 decades after the first large group of Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay, the colony had a functioning system of self-government composed of a governor and 2 House legislature. New England towns. The colony's method of distributing land helped to further its communal ideal. Unlike Virginia and Maryland, where individual planters acquired head rights and sited their farms separately, in Massachusetts groups of men, often from the same English village, applied together to the General Court for grants of land on which to establish towns, which was novel governance units that did not exist in England. Understandably, the grantees copied the villages whence they had come. First, they laid out lots of houses and a church. Then they gave each family parcels of land scattered around the town center. A pasture here, a woodlot there, an arable field elsewhere, reserving the best and largest plots for the most distinguished residents, including the minister. The quote, lower sort received smaller or less desirable allotments. Still, every man and even a few single women obtained land, which sharply differentiated these villages from their English counterparts. When migrants began to move beyond the territorial limits of Massachusetts Bay into Connecticut in 1636, into New Haven in 1638, and New Hampshire in 1638, the same pattern of town formation persisted. Town centers developed quickly, evolving in 3 distinct ways. Some, chiefly isolated agricultural settlements in the interior, tried to sustain Winthrop's vision of harmonious community life based on diversified family farms. A second group, the coastal towns like Boston and Salem, became bustling seaports, serving as focal points for trade and places of entry for thousands of new immigrants. The third category, commercialized agricultural towns, grew up in the Connecticut River Valley, where easy water transportation made it possible for farmers to sell surplus goods readily. In Springfield, Massachusetts, for example, the merchant entrepreneur William Pynchon and his son John began as fur traders and ended as large landowners with thousands of acres. Even in New England, then, the entrepreneurial spirit characteristic of the Chesapeake found expression. Yet the plans to profit from exports did not materialize quickly or easily. The new settlements lacked both the infrastructure necessary to support such enterprises and a climate conducive to staple crops. Pequot War and its aftermath. Migration into the Connecticut Valley ended the Puritans' relative freedom from clashes with nearby Pequots and Mohegans. The first English people in the valley moved there from Massachusetts Bay under the direction of their minister, Thomas Hooker. Although their new settlements were remote from other English towns, the wide river promised ready access to the ocean. The site had just one problem. It fell within the territory controlled by the powerful Pequot nation. The Pequots' dominance stemmed from their role as intermediaries in the trade between New England Algonquins and the Dutch in New Netherland. The arrival of English settlers ended the Pequots' monopoly over regional trading networks. Clashes between Pequots and English colonists began even before the establishment of settlements in the Connecticut Valley, but their founding tipped the balance toward war and resulted in a series of exceptionally violent clashes that came to be known as the Pequot War. The Pequots tried unsuccessfully to enlist local Mohegan, Niantic, and Narragansett groups in resetting English expansion. After 2 English traders were killed in 1636, not by Pequots, by the way, the English raided a Pequot village. In return, Pequots raided Wethersfield, Connecticut in April of 1637, killing 9 and capturing 2. That May, Englishmen and their Narragansett allies burned the main Pequot town on the Mystic River, slaughtering at least 400 men, women, and children. John Underhill, one of the leaders of the English raid, said it was terrible, quote, to see so many souls gasping on the ground so thick in some places that you could hardly pass along. Nonetheless, he insisted the colonists had, quote, sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings, since Scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. By September 1638, when the violence abated or ended, most survivors of the slaughter were enslaved, some in New England and more in the cane fields of the Caribbean. For the next 4 decades, the native peoples of New England accommodated themselves to the European invasion. They traded with the newcomers and sometimes worked for them, but for the most part, they resisted acculturation or incorporation into English society. Native Americans continued to use traditional farming methods, which did not employ plows or fences, and women, rather than men, remained the chief cultivators. The one European practice they consistently adopted was keeping livestock, for domesticated animals provided excellent sources of meat once the English had turned traditional hunting territories into farms, and wild game had disappeared. Missionary activities. Although the official seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony featured a native figure crying, quote, come over and help us, only a few Massachusetts clerics, most notably John Eliot and Thomas Mayhew, seriously undertook missionary work along the Algonquin. Eliot believed that native people could not be properly Christianized unless they were, quote, civilized. He insisted that converts live in towns, farm the land in English fashion, take English names, wear European-style clothing and shoes, cut their hair, and discard a wide range of their own customs. Because Eliot demanded cultural transformation from his adherents, he met with little success. At the peak of Eliot's efforts, only 1,100 native people, out of many thousands, lived in the 14th, quote, praying towns that he established, and just 10% of the town residents had been formally baptized. Eliot's failure to win converts contrasted sharply with the successful missions in New France. Puritan services lacked Catholicism's beautiful ceremonies and special appeal for women, and Calvinists could not promise believers a heavenly afterlife. Yet on the island of Martha's Vineyard, Thomas Mayhew showed that it was possible to convert substantial numbers of native peoples to Calvinist Christianity. He allowed Wampanoag Christians there to lead traditional lives, and he trained men of their own community to minister to them. What attracted native peoples to such religious ideas? Many must have turned to European religion to cope with the dramatic changes the intruders had caused. The combination of disease, alcohol, new trading patterns, and loss of territory disrupted customary ways of life to an unprecedented extent. Shamans had little success restoring traditional ways. Many native people must have concluded that the Europeans' own ideas could provide the key to survival in the new circumstances. John Winthrop's description of a great smallpox epidemic that swept through southern New England in the early 1630s reveals the relationship among smallpox, conversion to Christianity, and English land claims. Quote, a great mortality among the Indians, he noted in his journal in 1633. Divers of them, in their sickness, confessed that the Englishman's God was a good God, and that if they recovered, they would serve him. Most did not recover in January 1634. An English scout reported that smallpox had spread as far as any Indian plantation was known to the west. By July, most of the native peoples within a 300-mile radius of Boston had died of the disease. Winthrop noted with satisfaction that, quote, "The Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess." All right, that's the end of the reading, and here's a section on the inside about turkeys. Turkeys. As they neared the end of their first year in North America, the Plymouth colonists had a traditional English feast to celebrate the harvest. Famously, they invited Massasoit's Pokanokets to join them. And just as famously, they probably consumed the bird known even then as the, quote, wild turkey. But why, even then, but why was this bird, originally from America and still commonly eaten by Americans at Thanksgiving, given the name of a region of the then Ottoman Empire? The native peoples of the Americas had named the fowl in their own language. Aztecs, for example, called a male bird Huxolotl and a female Totolin, while some northeastern native peoples termed them both Nem. When Columbus returned from his first voyage, the birds were among the items he carried to Spain. The Iberian Peninsula had long served as a focal point for Mediterranean commerce, and Spanish mariners sailed frequently to ports in the Middle East. Before long, one of those Spanish vessels took some Hoxolotl and Totolin to the Ottoman Empire, or turkeys. There, farmers already familiar with distant Asian relatives of the bird began to improve the breed. Within a few decades, they succeeded in producing a plumper and tamer version of the American fowl. By the 1540s, that bird had arrived in England, and by the end of the century, turkeys were widely consumed for food throughout the British Isles. Accordingly, when Thomas Hero, in his 1588 Brief and True Report, mentioned the wild North American version of the birds, he termed them turkey cocks and turkey hens. He failed to give the names local native peoples use because, unlike many other new plants and animals he encountered, these birds were already familiar to him and his reading audience. The settlers at Jamestown and Plymouth recognized the birds they saw in their new homelands as relatives of the fowls they had consumed in England. But they regarded the wild American birds as inferior to the English ones. Swift and hungry foragers, they ravaged young crops and were viewed primarily as pests. Of course, any colonist fortunate enough to shoot one of them could have a tasty meal. So the settlers in both Virginia and New England soon imported English turkeys, which they raised for meat, along with chickens and pigs. The origin of the turkeys, most likely consumed at the so-called first Thanksgiving, remains a mystery. Were they the wild American birds or the tame Ottoman English variety? Doesn't matter. That they were termed turkeys linked these fowls of American origin to the Mediterranean, Europe, and the Middle East as prime example of animals in the Columbian exchange. The end.